Hello and welcome to the April 26th edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I am Anthony Bardaway. In my last episode, I mentioned that there was a bit of an overflow of material in that the previous episode was meant as a news episode that only partially talked about Hungary, and then I talked about Hungary for 2 hours, an hour after editing. And the central problem of having a news roundup of that case is that it did lead to a bit more of a backup. So I'm looking at my script right now, and I have 13 items on it, and thinking of adding more, which simply cannot be done. So I think I found a good place to bracket in this particular episode. That means that there will be another episode by the time the month is out. There is a substantial amount of material to go over, and a lot of this actually are things that I felt did not necessarily get the amount of attention they deserved in most other Ukraine coverage. Next episode will actually be the one that is getting a bit more of the discourse, I should say. There was a bombshell investigation by the Kyiv Independent into the Yellow Ribbon movement in the occupied territories and some of the poor decision making that went into the organization thereof, and especially safety concerns. That will definitely be next episode, whereas this episode will have two topics that I think is really going under the radar and is more into my zone of culture and religion. That is the deaths of two Orthodox patriarchs last month, the head of the Kyiv Patriarch Filaret, as well as the head of the Georgian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Ilia. So that will cover quite a bit of ground and what these two men meant and how their churches will go on going forward, as well as the issue of archaeology in Crimea and some of the law enforcement mechanisms to be used against illegal archaeology that is ongoing. Whereas the other topics we'll cover this episode will be a spate of mass shootings. Some of them we can pin on Russia, some we cannot, some we don't really know, as well as the ongoing siege of the town of Oleshky in the Kherson region, and some of the diplomatic efforts that Zelensky is making in the Middle East. And of course, before we go on, I would like to say that if you'd like to support Ukraine Without Hype, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype and join our list of supporters. Every little bit helps, and right now, I do kind of need a new set of body armor, so I would appreciate any help that they may be coming in. So thank you all very much, and on with the show. Well, today is a special anniversary. It is the 40th anniversary of the Chornobyl disaster. I feel as though Chernobyl is one topic that people actually did know about Ukraine before the full-scale invasion. In some cases, the only thing that people knew. Now, the story of the Chernobyl disaster is one that, because it is so well known, I feel like I don't necessarily have to go over it that much. The Chernobyl nuclear plant in the town of Pripyat, just to the north of Kyiv, suffered a catastrophic meltdown, and it was only through the rather extreme efforts of the cleanup team that a larger disaster was averted. In many ways, the Chernobyl disaster played a role in the lead up to Ukrainian independence. It was one of a string of disasters as well as state-run disasters. I don't know how else to phrase that, such as the invasion of Afghanistan, that led people in the 1980s to the conclusion that the Soviet government was something not worth defending, not worth keeping around. It completely got rid of the legitimacy of the Soviet government. And the Soviet government was, of course, suppressive throughout much of its existence. But the thing is, people understand when a state has control over them, but they see it as real. It's present anyway. It could be present in good ways. It can be present in bad ways, but it's present. It recognizes that they exist, even if it's going to do something suppressive. And in the post-Stalin era especially, the repressions had kind of decreased to the point where if you were not actively a dissident, it probably wasn't going to hurt you that much, which is the case with most authoritarian states. As long as you don't go against it, you'll probably be fine. That's the case in Russia today. But it was these disasters, the Chernobyl disaster, an earthquake in Armenia, again, the invasion of Afghanistan, that told people that the government didn't care about them, and therefore they didn't have to care about the government anymore. And so when it came time for the dissolution of the Soviet Union, no one protected it. There was the hardliner coup in August of 1991 that tried in vain to keep something together, but there was no support for it. Everyone knew that it was done. This disaster, it didn't kill that many people directly, but the radiation that it unleashed caused problems for years. It is extremely common for a Ukrainian born in the late 1980s through 2000s even to have issues with their thyroid. Thyroid conditions are so terribly common. I mean, it's not something that comes up in day-to-day discussion. Hey buddy, how's your thyroid doing today? Nothing like that, but statistically very common. When you know people, this is something that many of them have to deal with, and Chernobyl's not the only reason for that. Heavy industry itself is radioactive, but it was a big one. And then came the cleanup crews. If it wasn't for the cleanup crew putting themselves in extreme risk, there would have been a much larger disaster, like I said. If you watch the TV show on HBO, Chernobyl, one thing that you notice is that people are saying that if this doesn't happen, then there will be a disaster. Well, in real life, we know that the disaster was contained, and that became a bit of a criticism of the TV show, saying, well, there wasn't the bad things that they said were going to happen did not actually happen. Well, that's because they went through great lengths to prevent it. People sacrifice their health and in some cases their lives in order to prevent those worst things from happening, to prevent the radiation from reaching the groundwater, for example, to prevent the nuclear waste to be sitting out longer than it actually was, to make things as close to safe as possible. It took a lot of people sacrificing their well-being in order to do that. And afterwards, they were not treated very well. Even in the independence era, the Chernobyl responders often did not get the support that they required, leading again to more distrust in the state. And very curiously, one fact that is sometimes neglected about the late Soviet era is that a lot of the political dissident movements early on were environmental ones. The Narodny Ruch, the People's Movement of Ukraine, was one of the most important of the dissident movements in Ukraine in the 1980s and played a very significant role in Ukrainian independence. It was the kind of liberal nationalist movement that really took center stage and unfortunately was kind of pushed aside by oligarchic political forces rather than these more liberatory ones. But in the 80s, it had a very notable environmental outlook. This can be considered a safer topic. It's easier to talk about the health of the environment than it was to talk about independence. One was within the bounds of things that could be talked about and the other was not. But still, there was a very heavy emphasis on these environmental factors, and one of its important campaigns in the 80s was this all-Ukrainian environmental campaign, and it was a response to the Chernobyl disaster. Now, the disaster was in 1986, while the all-Ukrainian environmental campaign happened in 1989. But the issue of Chernobyl and the issue of the effects that it had on people, because this wasn't just a matter of political choices. People can say to themselves that as long as I don't cross the government, I'll be okay, and that was true. But when you have this nuclear power disaster that led to so many negative health side effects, that's something that people were able to much more concretely campaign around. It was a direct problem that could have a direct solution and allowed that to be piggybacked upon by other dissident movements that had a bit more abstract or broader goals, such as independence. So when we think about Chernobyl, we do have to keep this in mind. It is not merely the disaster itself that was important. It was, of course, the negative side effects of the disaster, the effects it had on people throughout the country and in many ways throughout the continent. Belarus got hit even harder by it than Ukraine did, but also this fact that it was a moment of state weakness, a moment of state neglect that proved to people that the Soviet Union had to go and be replaced, and became a catalyst for the independence movement that followed only a short few years later. So that is one thing to keep in mind with this Chernobyl anniversary, that even in authoritarian states such as the Soviet Union, there is a social contract, and when that social contract is broken, people will and ought to look for alternatives. Now on to some of the battlefield updates, and I think for the near future, I will not be doing very many battlefield updates. I made some rather extensive segments on these, especially in January and February, about the nature of the current battlefield and the use of drones and all that. That has not yet changed or necessarily needs many updates. I'm sure if you are especially curious to whatever specific advances anyone is making on the battlefield right now, there are better resources for that, such as Deep State Map, for the most kind of direct information to see it visually. But right now, the situation that we are in is that the winter offensive by the Russians did not accomplish all that much. Since taking Hulaipola, there has not been any big shifts that have happened on the battlefield. And overall, what we're doing right now is basically just waiting for whenever the next Russian offensive will be, probably later in the spring towards the summer, if we're going off of normal schedules. And there does seem to be a current Russian buildup in the area south of Pokrovsk, but this is very much still in the preparation phase, and there's not many things that are changing at the moment for me to update you. So if you do not hear me talking about battlefield updates for a while, it's because that situation has not especially changed. However, there are two things that should be noted right now. The first of these is that the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade has announced that they're able to take a position using only drones to actually take land. And this made a lot of big headlines. This was an immense change in how wars can be fought when you're literally just sending in remote controlled robots. Not only in the air, as people often think about, but also on the ground. We have advanced to the point where drones are also like these mini tanks, also, you can think of in a way, these all-terrain vehicles with guns on them that can be controlled in much the same way that your standard airborne drone would be. Drones are being used for resupply. Drones are being used for evacuating casualties. Drones are now being used for absolutely everything. But this announcement that they're able to actually take a position on their own without any humans around, that's could potentially solve a lot of problems. Ukraine has had to deal with a very severe manpower shortage, and if that manpower shortage can be made up for with robots, then it's a game changer. However, I did have some apprehensions about this. This was in many ways PR. The first reason why I say this isn't actually the first time that they've made this announcement, or it's confusing over what they're saying this is exactly the first time they're doing it. There have been times in the past where Russian soldiers were captured using only drones. That's actually fairly common. There have been times where they would say that a drone would be able to make this advance on its own. So I'm not sure what exactly they mean by the first time that a position was held by a drone. Maybe this was the first time they're able to let that drone actually sit there and hold the position. They've not been super detailed about what this was. I understand some reasons why and why not. They would not be so open with this information. Obviously, they don't want to be too detailed because detail lets Russians know how they did it and lets Russians duplicate that success. So you don't want to be too detailed in how you say things. But also this PR angle that they are able to say this and they get the headlines, it's on CNN, everyone was talking about it. I don't know exactly what is the first for. I know that they have said that they have used drones on their own in assaults before, and I know that these assaults have been from time to time successful on their own before. So I just don't know what this story is necessarily supposed to be saying. Aside from the massive headline. And the other side of this, and this is the one that I've been seeing much more from soldiers, is that yes, you can put a remote controlled wheeled machine gun in a position, but does that really count as holding a position? Throughout all the wars of history, as advances in airborne assaults and bombings and missiles and all that have gone forward, ultimately the infantryman placing his boots in an exact location is the thing that determines taking a territory. We don't know if the standard for that has actually changed yet, both in the more abstract sense of if you cannot put a human in this position, can you really say that you took it, as well as the more direct in that right now, as I've described in very great lengths earlier in the year, the definition of taking a position, the definition of taking territory right now is very, very nebulous. It's possible to infiltrate pretty deep behind enemy lines by a couple of kilometers and put someone in a spot. This goes in both directions. Either the Russians infiltrating deeper into Ukrainian held territory and Ukrainians going in the other direction. But when we say that a Ukrainian soldier is hiding out in a ditch somewhere, 3 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian soldier, right now we don't count that as taken territory. People will, especially on the Russian side. You see a lot of very enthusiastic versions of what is considered Russian occupied that is really not accurate. The fact that a Russian soldier is able to show up on the outskirts of Konstantinivka and then immediately get blown up does not mean that he took Konstantinivka. So we have to be more discerning and more subjective about what held territory is. And the standard that we have been using is, can they be reliably resupplied? Is their position in this location secure? Can someone else go to that position? The standard of holding territory right now, if you're going to treat it with any amount of seriousness, it has to be pretty high. And I don't think that being able to put one of these remote controlled machine guns into a spot really meets that definition. We have to be careful with that. So I don't want to be too pessimistic. Very much am looking towards the advances in drone technology, the ways that drones are able to take jobs away from soldiers, that allow people to protect their own lives. The wall of drones, as it is called, is an incredibly effective defense that has prevented too many Russian advances. Drones are what this war is about, but when these headlines come up, we still do have to be discerning. We still have to keep in mind the actual results and the actual standards that we set, the actual metrics that we go by, and not just jump on every bandwagon that we see. We just be careful with that. I know that we all like to see news of these great big changes that will drive the Russians out and all that, and in this case, the increased effectiveness of these ground-based drones are something that I expect to accelerate within the next year. The drones of next year will make the drones of this year look like nothing, just like the drones of this year make the drones of last year look primitive in comparison. Just be objective is all I'm saying. Whereas the other battlefield update is that in the context of the wars in Iran and elsewhere in the Middle East right now have been driving up the cost of oil, and the large fear has been that Russia would take advantage of this in order to solve its financial problems that have become more and more looming on them. Ukraine has responded by making its attacks on Russian oil infrastructure, oil export, have gotten increasingly effective and devastating. And the largest attack in these recent weeks has been on the Tuapse city in Krasnodar Krai in the Kuban region of Russia on the Black Sea. It's an industrial town, it's a port town close to Sochi that is used for oil refining. There's a very major oil refinery in this town that was hit by Ukraine very hard. And this refinery being hit was especially devastating. There's reports of a, quote, black rain in the area. There was a mass die-off of some of the local wildlife, and that is what a lot of international media has picked up on it as this environmental disaster. And yes, I am an environmentalist. I don't like seeing this. I don't like the long-term effects that this war is causing, but as always, Ukraine seems to be being held to a higher standard than the Russians are on this. These refineries, these export facilities have to be hit. Russia is fueled, pun very much intended on that, by its fossil fuel exports. They are the key to beating Russia. If Russia can no longer afford the war, it can no longer carry out the war. And the side effect of that there will be oil spills and other environmental disasters that come from hitting refineries, that come from hitting these oil tankers, but that ends if Russia ends the war. And just the Black Sea has already been very heavily affected by the Russian invasion, especially the Sea of Azov. Very early on in the war, the mass use of Russian military in the Sea of Azov, as well as the environmental spillovers from the destruction of Mariupol, led to a mass die-off of dolphins. The Russians destroyed the Novokhovka Dam, which caused all kinds of problems after that, and they just tried to destroy another dam in the Kharkiv region. In the main areas that have seen the heaviest combat, this continuous strip of no man's land extending from the Dnipro River up to the Kharkiv region that is tens of kilometers wide, that has been ruined in so many profound ways. The amount of unexploded ordnance and pollution that has tainted that area, that will probably never be cleaned up. That's probably more or less permanent on any time frame that we can conceive of. And of course, it's okay to mention the obvious environmental problems that come with targeting Russia's oil industry, but when that is mentioned on its own, apart from the shocking environmental damage that Russia is doing as a part of this war that it launched for no good reason, it feels like an incomplete story, even when coming from sources that are more or less sympathetic to Ukraine. This next one is not so much about the battlefield, but it is something that's happening in proximity to the front line. That's the next obvious topic to talk about, and that's the siege of Oleshky. Oleshky is a town on the other side of the Dnipro River from Kherson that has been under Russian occupation. When the Russians evacuated Kherson of collaborators as well as their own forces, their first stopover was to Oleshky before heading further inland and making Hnechesk the center of the occupation authorities. Oleshky, as well as some of the nearby towns, though Oleshky is one of the larger ones, have faced some of the most extreme deprivations of the Russian occupation, along with others such as Holopristan. There have been extensive kidnappings, tortures, murders that happened in Oleshky and these other villages, in part because it is so close to the front lines. There is no other inhabited areas in between Oleshky and Kherson. Well, there was Dachi. That's pretty much gone now, meaning that the Russians are particularly paranoid about anyone who may be living there and have treated them as hostiles. During the flood of Kherson, when Russia destroyed Novokhovka Dam, leading to the extreme flooding of a lot of things downriver, I mentioned in my reporting at the time that the city of Kherson itself was not as affected outside of some of the low-lying river-level areas. Most of Kherson is more elevated than that on a hill. Oleshky's not on that hill. Oleshky is not only water level, but surrounded by all kinds of wetlands and lakes and other parts of the Dnipro River Delta, so would be vulnerable to flooding under normal conditions, and it was drowned. Oleshky was underwater, and the Russians did not rescue them, and in fact prevented people from fleeing Oleshky to escape from the waters. We don't know how many people died. Much like with everything else that is happening under Russian occupation, we really just don't have a good idea of how many people died. There is still some contact with people there. There are still people fleeing from there who can bring bits and pieces of the story with them, but no one individual in these towns is able to tell the whole story, and ultimately they're being shielded from seeing the whole story, and the Russians don't want them to know the whole story. It's not convenient for them to know. And so some larger number of people who died in that flooding died in Oleshky. There were attempts to rescue people by Ukrainian special forces, and some of these succeeded. They were able to get some people to the other side of Kherson, but not that many, and the Russians did fire on these rescue attempts, so not large numbers. And ever since then, it's been like that. They have faced the full brunt of the Russian occupation, and they just were not allowed to leave, or at least it was very difficult for them to do so. The Russians tried to prevent it. So it's not particularly a small town. It's a city of 40,000, mid-sized city, that beginning this year There's only a few thousand left. But beginning this year, there has been reports that the Russians are essentially trying to deliberately starve it. Some have said that there were no deliveries of food and other humanitarian supplies to Oleshky since the start of the year. They are running out of food. They are quite literally at the stage of hunting rats and birds. Some other reporting has said that some supplies have entered into Oleshky, some very small number of supplies have entered Oleshky, but the only people who are allowed access to it are those who have agreed to take Russian citizenship. This is not unique in the occupied territories. It has long been the policy that gaining access to any kinds of social services, including hospitals, has been restricted to people who agree to take on Russian citizenship and become Russian. But this is, like with everything else with Oleshky, an extreme example where people are going to be starved to death for not being Russian. And when people try to escape this situation, the Russians have turned drones on them. And keep in mind, again, this is within the zone of Russian occupation. These are people who are living already under Russian occupation. If they see someone who lives in Oleshky, that is who they claim is their new countryman, and instead they're just killing them with drones for trying to leave town. And leave town not even to go into Ukrainian-controlled territory, but to leave town to go further into Russian-controlled territory. Ukraine has sounded the alert on this situation that's happening in Oleshky and the nearby villages. Ukraine's Parliamentary Commissioner for Human Rights, Dmytro Lubinets, is trying to organize an international response to this, allow an evacuation corridor out of Oleshky across the Dnipro River into Ukrainian-controlled territory. I highly doubt that this would happen. Safety is only, relative safety. They'd probably still have to get further away from the Dnieper River to actually be safe, but not starving is only a 20-minute ride away. They're 20 minutes away from being safe. They're on the wrong side of that line. This is why giving up land to Russia is not just giving up land. We have to ask what happens to the people who live on that land. Oleshky is firmly under Russian occupation. It's not being assaulted by Russia. It's not, the normal deprivations of war and collateral damage of a city under siege. They control it already. And this is what they choose to do when controlling it, is try to starve people to death for being Ukrainian, which is, of course, a part of a much larger system of dispossession, of kidnapping kids, of brainwashing, concentration camps, of torture, of surveillance, genocide that can only end with the end of Russian occupation. Any amount of Ukraine that Russia takes becomes a nightmare. Of course, the act of taking it is itself a nightmare. The nightmare just continues after. Crediting much of this reporting has been done by Zorina Zabrowski. She really is the main foreign journalist working out of Kherson. Follow her on whatever she's doing. She's also done some political activism to try to alleviate some of this suffering, and has a documentary out titled Kherson Human Safari that was featured at the Munich Security Conference. Big deal. And has been kind of doing the rounds of, I think it might have been shown in Congress, I believe. But yeah, see that Kherson Human Safari and follow Sabrina Zabrisky. Zarina Zabrisky. The next topic to go over is troubling in a way that it does not necessarily have to do with war. And that is that there have been a number of prominent shootings that have taken place in Ukraine in the past weeks. I suppose the first one I'll talk about happened in Zakarpattia. In a village in the Zakarpattia region, on April 16th, a schoolboy opened fire on his school. Thankfully, nobody died in this. A 9th grader took out a handgun, started threatening others in his class. He fired 2 shots. He injured a classmate, but again, did not kill anyone, thankfully, before running away and was later detained. This happened in proximity to another attack in the Zakarpattia region where a kid brought a knife to class and threatened to injure his classmates. The unfortunate way to frame this is that as an American, these stories have been, normalized. A school shooting that happens in the United States rarely lasts very long in the public consciousness, especially if no one dies. Honestly, at this point, you have to have a pretty high kill count for it to even stick around in headlines for more than a week. That's just the reality of how America is. However, Ukraine is not quite like that. School shootings are not just a part of the zeitgeist that you absorb passively and don't even think about anymore. They are unusual and they are shocking, even on this level. They're not a thing that happens, at least with any amount of regularity. So that alone would have been enough of a headline in Ukraine. School shooting, 1 injured, suspect in detention. But it's the story behind the story that has people more worried. And it's something that feels like a Lifetime movie or Stranger Danger kind of story, but Ukrainian kids are being recruited online, in this case through online gaming, in order to commit crimes by Russian intelligence services. This is far from the first time this has happened. The Russians have made a habit of trying to contact Ukrainian teenagers especially Ukrainian teenagers from some kind of disadvantaged background, homeless, drug addiction, broken families and orphanages, in some way vulnerable, like any cult or gang. Or this is a thing that hostile actors have been doing for as long as civilization existed. If you want to recruit people to do bad things, find people who do not have social support needed. I don't know if that is the case here. It has not been pointed out that they are especially deprived, but in other cases, they have recruited, especially poorer or drug addicted or something like that, teenagers to say, I will give you $200 if you take this backpack and put it next to the police station. Don't look in the backpack. You don't need to know what's in the backpack. Just take it from point A to point B and I'll give you money. And that has been the source of many attacks, especially on police stations. Military establishments especially have been on the receiving end of this. But with those, or with factories, you could see the military logic of it, I suppose. It is grim that these Ukrainians are being recruited, sometimes against their knowledge, to take part in terrorist attacks, though they should probably understand that that's what's going on. There have been information campaigns to tell people that this is what's happening. But a police station, military recruitment center, a factory, a logistics point, it makes sense. This, though, of inducing teenagers to take part in school shootings, school stabbings, that's just pure terror. It exists for the psychological impact of it. We can get to your kids. We can get them to do things. And more than that, the other school kids that your child goes to school with, the other people in 9th grade, they might be listening to us. They might do something because of us. We have that power. We have that grip on the youth to make them do these random acts of violence that exist purely for the sake of violence. They have no rhyme or reason or logic to them, just to cause pain. And there's the old adage, the children are the future. Seems trite, but the idea of Russia being able to control the youth in this way, and of course it's a very small phenomenon. We're talking about 2 people here in Zakarpattia. There's more than 2 teenagers in Zakarpattia. They're a very small percentage of the total teenager population, but psychologically, the ability for your enemy to influence your own future in that way, that's part of why the issue of kidnapping and brainwashing in the occupied territories is so frightening. Again, that's the occupied territories. That makes sense under its own genocidal logic. In Zakarpattia, that's relatively safe from the Russians, yet the Russians are still able to do the same thing there, to, of course, a much lesser degree. But the same idea of a thing there that can happen in Kherson, in Donetsk, Crimea, that's not how it's supposed to be, even under the horrifying definition of what people understand is how things work. But this next shooting that happened that was much more deadly, is not as straightforward as that. On April 18th, there was a mass shooting at a grocery store in the Demyevka neighborhood in the Holosivsky district of Kyiv. This is on the western half of the city in the southern portion. Now, this happened at around 4:30 in the afternoon and began with, apparently, a dispute. And for the point of this, I'm not going to name the shooter. I think that is the policy that Americans have adopted in our mass shooting epidemic, and I'll keep at it. So I'm not going to name the shooter himself. So the shooter had a quarrel with one of his neighbors, at which point he produced a rubber bullet pistol. These are sometimes called concussion pistols. They're basically like a BB gun, but hurts a lot more. As a foreigner and as a journalist, I'm allowed to have one of these rubber bullet guns, though I'm not allowed to have an actual gun, but I'm going to push that conversation for the end of the actual description. And after he shot these rubber bullets, he lit his own apartment on fire, something that was not discovered until after this whole event took place and people were investigating where he was. He had set his apartment on fire, took out a real rifle, not just a rubber bullet one, went to the nearby Velmart supermarket, shot a bunch of people on the street, went inside, held the people inside hostage until the eventual police response that killed him. All in all, 7 dead, including some who died in the hospital later. Several others were hospitalized, including a 4-month-old who suffered carbon monoxide poisoning as a result of him lighting his apartment on fire. And again, this is something that does not happen here, leading to questions of how. Well, it turned out that the shooter is originally from Moscow, which was an immediate red flag. He had served previously in the Ukrainian military, but before any conflict between Russia and Ukraine took place, so that's not exactly a disqualifier from having Russian sympathies. Between 2007 and 2017, he had moved back to Russia to live in Ryazan before returning to Bakhmut. And it's this connection to Bakhmut that leads to some more information, because he was very much a pro-Russia kind of guy. Why someone with so many pro-Russian feelings would choose to move to Ukraine and beyond that continue to live in Ukraine when he has the option of leaving, it doesn't really make sense. Go where you're happy. And of course, he made many anti-Ukrainian statements. Social media was full of anti-Ukrainian statements, full of anti-Semitic statements. He had wished that Russia had captured Bakhmut. There's something in there about hoping that Bakhmut was destroyed. Was an extreme pro-Russia guy, to the point of wanting Ukraine to be outright destroyed. So why live in Kyiv? Why do that? Just go. We did not go. And because of all this, it was presumed by many at first that he was a Russian agent of some kind. And it does feel like it, doesn't it? This is the profile of a Ukrainian who would support Russia and do something like this on behalf of Russia. Everything fell into place that he would be a Russian asset. But it gets a bit deeper and more abstract than that, because the other aspect of his personality that has come out was that he was just a terrible person in general. There were so many reports of him just fighting with neighbors. There are complaints against him for assaulting people. He's just a violent, unpleasant guy. And so, honestly, considering the fact that since the shooting, there has been no further information that he was working for Russian intelligence services, I am assuming, making a real shot in the dark, that this is more an extension of him being a violent monster than it is necessarily an extension of him being pro-Russian. He had a violent outburst that accelerated from this, of course, fueled by his anti-Ukrainian sentiments, and the fact that he hated everyone around him probably was a factor in him being violent towards everyone around him. And really, what this highlights to me is my ongoing theory that Russia is just a magnet for the absolute worst people in the world. I think that's not so much that he was violent because he was anti-Ukrainian, but rather he was pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian because he was violent. The profile of the pro-Russian Ukrainian is typically someone who is troublesome in their day-to-day life. They're not nice people. They're not going to be like the nicest guy in the world who always helps out his neighbors and believes in, fellowship between men. That guy's not pro-Russian. The guy who's pro-Russian is the one who hates everyone around him, who wants Russia to destroy all of that as an outgrowth of their just general nihilism, and that does not get limited to Ukraine. Tommy Robinson is not pro-Russian by accident. He's pro-Russian because he's a monster, and that's a new way for him to be a monster. Like, this is a black and white conflict in so many ways, and that's not to say that there aren't real unpleasant folks among the pro-Ukrainian side. Certainly not. But people become pro-Russian because they suck. It's just a new way for them to suck. So is it possible that this guy was recruited by the Russians? Very possible. Like, I'm still kind of surprised that there's been no further information about that. I'm kind of expecting someone to say, well, we found that he talked to some FSB officer in Ryazan or something. I don't know. But that information hasn't come out yet, which leaves us for him just being a violent guy who did something violent because he always did something violent, and was just a gradual increase in that violence throughout his life until it ended the way such things end, in blood and pain. But after this all happened, it ignited a much larger debate in Ukraine about the idea of public safety. Because during all this, the two officers who were the most on scene when it happened ran away. Now, this is again something in America that has happened. The Uvalde mass shooting, the school, where the officers on scene did not engage with the school shooter, led to a mass outcry afterwards that eventually led to several ranking officers within that police system to resign, but only after mass national, and I mean truly national. This was the news story that the Uvalde Police Department were cowards who let children die. If it wasn't for that outcry, they would have kept doing what they were doing. Everyone would have kept their jobs. But there's too much public pressure that made them resign. In Ukraine, the way I heard about this was when I heard that those police officers themselves were detained. They were arrested and got perp walked for their negligence of duty. So that's the difference. And since the police were not able to stop this before people were killed, and the police actually abandoned their duties, even if they later would face and are in the process of facing justice for that, point is that they didn't. As is often in America after one of these shootings, there has been open debate about gun rights, about people being allowed to own private weapons. Now, the shooting was done with a weapon that was legally owned. There are more restrictive gun laws in Ukraine than there are in the US. There's more restrictive gun laws anywhere than there is in the US, but not so restrictive that's impossible. It's not Japan or something. And so the rifle, the carbine, that was used in this shooting was legally owned. But there was then the debate, including by very high-ranking government officials, including by the Interior Minister himself, the person in charge of law enforcement, Ihor Klimenko, that there should be more mass ownership of guns. Now, just to give my own priors on this. In the United States, I'm not a big gun control guy. I am largely in favor of permissive gun laws in the United States, in large part because the people who want to kill you are armed. You should be armed as well. But here, this is one of those topics I like to step away from. So instead of offering a solution to this, I'm basically just saying this debate exists, is a thing that is occurring right now in Ukraine. But as someone who is not a Ukrainian citizen, I do not wish to interfere with that debate. Some of the factors that go into this debate, however, include the fact that when the invasion began, one of the things that allowed people to resist the invasion was the fact that the government distributed guns. There was a people's militia that fought against the Russian invasion, and this people's militia, especially in places in the north of the country, around Sumy, for example, around Chernihiv, especially in the rural areas, were able to carry out a guerrilla campaign against the Russian occupation, partially because there was mass distribution of guns. The amusing part about that might be that these guns themselves are not always legally obtained. I've heard some stories, but heard another story more recently about the local territorial defense meeting up, not really being well equipped, having a local businessmen, throw quotation marks around the word businessmen there, showed up, heard of this problem, and would later arrive with a whole truck full of AK-47s. So yes, those were not legal AK-47s, but they took part in the defense of the country. Everyone must do their part. Everyone. including, them. And because there's so many soldiers, it's hard to be completely vacuum sealed of who has access to weapons and who does not. So it's already kind of in the ether. And that's kind of one side of this. The other is, of course, the usual America style debate that when things like this mass shooting would happen, if someone with a gun was on hand, a good guy with a gun would take out the bad guy with the gun. Again, that's a part of the debate that I'm going to skip away from. But then the anti side of this argument is that Ukraine is a very traumatized country. So, yes, there are a lot of soldiers, there are a lot of policemen, there are a lot of security officials who are armed. A lot of civilians might have trauma. That trauma may lead to acts of violence and the lack of weapons in the hands of many civilians. Ukraine's not that locked down as it comes to gun control, but it's not a widespread thing to own a gun, I wouldn't say. Unless you lived in the countryside, different. Some of them do. But because there isn't mass gun ownership, there's less that someone with heavy trauma, with heavy mental health issues might do. And I'll think of an example in that before the full-scale invasion, of course, there were already many traumatized veterans and people from the conflict areas. And one person, many years ago, I don't remember the details too cleanly, posted up on one of Kyiv's bridges with a hand grenade and said that if you don't do X, Y, or Z, I'm literally remembering this as I'm saying this. This is not in the notes. Threatened to blow up this hand grenade along with himself and maybe people around him without doing these demands. And he was very heavily traumatized. He was very heavily traumatized from the 2014, 2015 war going onwards. And there are people in that mental health state. And so too many people with guns, it increases the likelihood that an incident could happen. But those are just the sides of the debate. Not taking sides. Not taking sides. But that is one of the more important debates happening domestically right now. But before moving on, we must say that where there are bastards like the shooter, there are also heroes. One story that did come out of this is about Alexander Perka. He was 72 years old, and by profession he was a janitor. And beyond that was known as a great neighbor who took care of the common spaces, put up trees, all that kind of thing, helped out the local kids. And on the day of that supermarket shooting in Kyiv, he saw a child who had already taken a bullet and was on the ground wounded, and used his body to shield that of the child's. In doing so, he himself was shot and was killed. Alexander, you died a hero. Svetla Pimyat. This next topic is one that I've wanted to talk about the most, because I do think of myself as a bit of a religion reporter. But when I do, I usually avoid personalities. I talk more in terms of institutions and populations and broad strokes, because often is the case that these issues get dragged down into questions of personality. The Russians, especially, have tried to often steer the issue of the Ukrainian Orthodoxy into being about particular people they bear grudges against, rather than the actual question of autonomy and whether or not the Russian Orthodox Church has it. And the answer is they don't have it. But that said, that has often meant that some of these figures I have neglected, some of them quite fascinating. And in the last month I should say, at the end of March, 2 patriarchs in Eastern Orthodoxy both died. Not in any kind of suspicious circumstance, of course. They were very elderly men. The first I'll talk about was 97 years old, but they did die in close proximity to each other, and they were both buried on the same day. And these are Patriarch Filaret of the Kyiv Patriarchate and Patriarch Ilia of Georgia. I'll talk about Filaret first. Patriarch Filaret was the head of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Kyiv Patriarchate, not to be confused with the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and I'll get into why that's important in the course of this story. But he was born Mikhailo Antonovich Denisenko in 1929, making him 12 years old at the beginning of the invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany. And that is always a difficult one to really wrap your head around when it comes to Ukraine, is that the older generation saw their lives completely upended. I talked about this during in my last World War II episode, but it was truly apocalyptic. And this generation of Ukrainians, of everyone in the Soviet Union, everyone in Europe, but Ukraine and Belarus saw the most devastation. And Mihailo, later Filaret, was from the Donetsk region. And like many of his generation, his father was killed in the war. His father was in the Red Army, as many were, and was killed in the Soviet recapturing of the Kyiv area, like many were. The Soviet assault on Kyiv was notoriously bloody, was notoriously a waste of life in a lot of ways. But as this kid who grew up surrounded by absolute horrors, dead father, he turned to religion, as many would. Though you may note that the Soviet Union was an officially atheist country, meaning that finding faith in God had some complications. But as a part of the war effort, one of the things that Stalin did was he revived the Russian Orthodox Church as a way of fueling patriotism. And immediately after the war, Mihailo began his religious education in Odessa, at the Odessa Seminary, as well as in Moscow. And it was in his time in Moscow for his religious studies that became an associate of Patriarch Alexei I, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. And yes, keep this in mind. This is the Russian Orthodox Church that this is all in until it isn't anymore. And he proved to be very talented. Not only talented, but with the right connections. Shortly after graduating and receiving his ordination, he began to quickly climb the ranks and served in senior positions within only a few years. A real rising theological star. And in 1957, which is, just a tiny bit over a decade since he began his own religious education, he was the inspector of the Kyiv Theological Seminary. And shortly after that, made the rector. I'm not Orthodox. Maybe 12 years is enough time to go from going to beginning your religious education to heading a seminary, but that seems unusual to me. But a real rising star within the church. He was appointed to ever-increasing levels of responsibility, and already in 1960, he's appointed the manager of the Ukrainian Exarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church. This was not real authority in the sense that we would later see, but in a way, this kind of put him at the top of the Orthodox Church as it existed in Ukraine. Now, this wasn't the same level of independence that would come later and as exists now, but the Ukrainian Exarchate was the organization of the Russian Orthodox Church as it existed in Ukraine, and he was just put in a position of management within it. And from that position of management was later given the archbishopric of Kyiv as well as Oleshky, Western Ukraine, with several other important positions, including bishop in Vienna, in Moscow, all these, I'm not going to run through his entire CV here, but a lot of stuff, including his foreign positions, really stuck out. Leaving the Soviet Union was a big deal, and he was named Bishop of Vienna. Vienna, a neutral country, a country that was the center of the Soviet-American spy war, and there he was as a senior Soviet official, which is what Russian Orthodox Church officials were. They were Soviet officials. And as Soviet officials, he was, of course, connected to the KGB. They all were. And he was very open about this in his life. He spilled the beans of what it meant to be a hierarch in the Russian Orthodox Church. It meant that you were being handled by the KGB. He claimed that he himself was managed more directly by the Politburo. Yeah, he told how that all worked. We don't have to rely on insinuation. He was handled by the KGB while he was a Russian official in Austria, which, by the way, is still a major spy den for Russians. But in 1968, he really reaches new heights in authority, in that he is the new head of the Ukrainian Exarchate. Again, the Exarchate, Exarch is outside, X. The Ukrainian Exarchate is the organization of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, and he is now the head of it in 1968, meaning that he is now the second most important person within Russian Orthodoxy, making him both a national leader in Ukraine as well as a high-ranking Soviet official as well. During his term as the Exarch of Ukraine, he attempted a lot of localization of the church, including the use of Ukrainian language, which even now became a very serious point of contention between Moscow and Kyiv, as far as religiously and everything else. But in this case, particularly religiously, the use of Ukrainian language within religious education, religious texts. And this wasn't wholly about his feeling of wanting Ukraine to be bigger. Of course, it was a part of that. He always had a level of patriotism for Ukraine, but also this was also part of a anti-Catholic measure. The underground churches in Ukraine, both the Catholic underground church, the Greek Catholic Church, as well as the underground Orthodox Church in Ukraine, were using Ukrainian language, were speaking to the Ukrainian people in their own language, to not act as though they were a foreign entity, and were able to recruit people because of that. And therefore, Filaret, his priestly name, decided that in order to compete with these other faiths, they had to do it in the Ukrainian language. So a little bit of genuine local patriotism and local Ukrainian cultural connectivity, but also a pragmatic meaning behind it as well. And so he was through the rest of the Soviet period. As the Soviet Union ends, he is the head of Orthodoxy in Ukraine. And then, in 1990, in the last full year of Soviet existence, the previous Patriarch of Moscow dies. And Filaret, who is in the number 2 spot, is one of the people favored to be the next Moscow Patriarch. He does not win, and instead chooses to focus on Ukraine. He considers this to be a blessing from God. Had he become the Moscow Patriarch, he would have become a Russian figure. But because he lost, he was able to become a Ukrainian one instead. And so he leads the Ukrainian Exarchate of Russian Orthodoxy into independent Ukraine. And we have to look at 2 tendencies here. One, the big tendency. The way Orthodoxy works is that ideally a country will have its own Orthodox church. Orthodoxy is largely organized along national lines, as thorny as that may be. That's as and when Ukraine has been able to get independence, they have tried to have an independent church. So in the 1920s, after the First World War, when Ukraine tried to break away from Muscovite control, there was the creation of what was called the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, which continued to exist in the diaspora after it was crushed in Ukraine. And now that Ukraine had independence again, it was time for another push to create an independent church, which is what he began to do in 1991. He supported Ukrainian independence as a state, as well as calling for the Ukrainian church to be granted independence from the Russian one. But it's this other tendency that leads to some of the problems that he had in his life, which is that he really wanted to be the guy in charge, and he lost. Something that would happen several other times in his life, and something that he did not enjoy very much. He was constantly had that number 1 position swiped away from him, which will become more relevant in more recent years. So yes, that Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, which I had said existed in the diaspora, there is now the question of bringing it back in to Ukraine. And so some of the Orthodox priests in Ukraine who had previously been part of the Moscow Patriarchate, Russian Orthodox Church, entered into communication with this Ukrainian church in exile and worked to kind of patch things back together to create a true Ukrainian church built upon the independent Ukrainian church which already existed, just in Canada instead of in Ukraine. And Filaret was a proponent of this. He tried to get people together for it, but as this was happening, he faced a revolt in his own priesthood. Several of his bishops basically did a coup against him for his talk of wanting independence from Russia, leading to what was called the Kharkiv Council in 1992, where, for his crimes of seeking independence for Ukrainian Orthodoxy, these more Russia-loyal bishops in Ukraine stripped him of his priesthood, which was supported, of course, by the Russian church. These priests and bishops and church officials who were loyal to Russia would then form the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate. they would be given a degree of independence for themselves, but only subordinate to Russia. Autocephaly is the word for when a church is given full independence. Filaret wanted autocephaly. These other priests who were loyal to Russia did not. They wanted to stay within Russian Orthodoxy, but accepted a greater degree of autonomy within Russian Orthodoxy, leading to this schism between the pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian parts of the church. The pro-Russian parts of the church are what is now called the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate or Ukrainian Orthodox Church. When you hear people complaining about the suppression of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, that's what they're talking about. Don't you worry. We're going to be talking more about the church next week as it exists with America. So keep this all in mind. But yeah, so the head of this exiled Ukrainian church, who again lived in Canada, Mitislav, and he was the obvious choice to be the head of this Ukrainian church because he was already the head of the Ukrainian church. And they had the pro-Ukraine priests had this council in 1992 where they formed what was called Ukrainian Orthodox Church Kyiv Patriarchate, which they said would be independent, and elected Mitislav to be the head of it. Though interestingly, he was not there at the time and did not give his direct approval. He was kind of made the head of Ukrainian Orthodoxy without wanting it. He did not feel like this process was ready yet, but he would die the next year, and so any objections that he may have had with being having a job thrust upon him quickly became irrelevant. He was in the last year of his life. He was probably not exactly very vital at this point. And so, I mean, he was a priest in the 40s, you know, he was old, leading to him dying and them naming a new head of this Kyiv Patriarchate, someone who was more local, Vladimir of Chernihiv. But again, this whole generation of priests were quite old, so he did not live much longer and eventually died in 1995. So we have this Ukrainian church that was founded in 1992. The first head, who did not really want to be head, died in 1993, and the second head, who replaced him, died in 1995, leading to Filaret being named the head of the Kyiv Patriarchate in 1995. However, I do have to step aside and say and talk about the funeral of Vladimir of Chernihiv, the head of the Kyiv Patriarchate from 1993 to 1995. When he dies, the original plan is to bury him in St. Sophia, one of the most prominent cathedrals in Kyiv. If you go to the city center, it is a museum now. It's not a functioning church, but it is a museum. It is very well preserved. There are really old frescoes. If you go to central Kyiv, the two churches that you'll see most readily are St. Sophia and St. Michael. St. Sophia is an original church. St. Michael's is a reconstruction. St. Michael's is a functioning church. St. Sophia is a museum. They are facing each other. Go see them. They're nice. So they take Vladimir's body to St. Sophia to bury him. However, this was now the presidency of Kuchma, and Kuchma was trying to maintain good relations with Russia. And this guy, Vladimir, was very much on Russia's bad side. He broke away from Russian Orthodoxy, which then, as is now, was considered something that the Russians were really, really mad about. And so for him to be buried on this very important site, St. Sophia, would have been an insult to Russia. Something which is no longer a concern, but in 1995 it still very much was. And so he is directed to be buried in this other cemetery in Kyiv. And they get the permission to go to this other cemetery in Kyiv. They did not go to that other cemetery in Kyiv. They went to St. Sophia with a big group of guys under the Ukrainian National Assembly, which was a nationalist right-wing organization. The funeral procession that was escorted by these UNA security guys break through a police cordon, preventing them from reaching St. Sophia. They fight the cops in order to do this. They were not able to actually enter the grounds of St. Sophia. So what they do is they take out the hammers, break through the sidewalk in front of this cathedral, bury him right in front of the church under what used to be sidewalk, place his tombstone, and by the time the police show up in order to evict them, they're not going to disinter a body. They kind of acted fast enough that it could not be reversed. Turing, a respected religious figure, in 1995, really any time, but the particulars of the situation of Ukraine kind of turning back to Russia, it was a real sensitive thing. And so, if you're going to go to St. Sophia's right now, before you enter the gate, look to your right, you will see a tomb that is of Volodymyr of Chernihiv. In Patreon, I will post the photo I took of this right before this recording. This was a very big deal at the time. Again, because of this issue of how Ukraine would be independent from Russia in the 90s, this was a huge question of how that would work. A question that was not truly solved until 2014. And in a way, that's kind of what this war is about, is that Ukraine chose to be independent. And really, this is one of the early acts of asserting Ukrainian independence, was this funeral. But anyway, after this happens, Filaret is named the new head of the Kyiv Patriarchate. He is now the guy in charge. But he just had a couple of years of conflict with other parts of this church, with other members who were more loyal to the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, the UAOC. And a lot of churches defected because they didn't want him to be in charge. They tried to form their own separate thing directly under the UAOC, but within a pretty short amount of time, those conflicts were resolved, and most everyone kind of banded back together. The UAOC continued to exist until 2019, though much smaller than the Kyiv Patriarchate. And it was during this time, between 1995 to 2019, when Filaret was the head of what was now the largest church in Ukraine. The Kyiv Patriarchate had more worshippers than the Russian church and much more than the UAOC. And it was now his job to build this church into independent, self-sustaining church. He worked to increase religious education. He oversaw the reconstruction of St. Michael's Church, which would become a center point of the Kyiv Patriarch. In this time of a lot of split loyalties in Ukrainian political figures regarding Ukraine, regarding Russia, regarding Europe, this Kyiv Patriarchate becomes a major anchor point of pro-Ukrainian independence feeling, as opposed to Russia. It was a part of nation building, really. And what other conflicts, what other difficulties that Filaret had, we cannot take this away from him. He not only kept this idea of Ukrainian church independence alive, he was the head of the largest church in Ukraine. And the largest church of Ukraine was pushing these ideas of being pro-Ukrainian. That's not something that every Orthodox church, especially those within Russia's orbit, could say. To pray in Ukrainian, to this church that is Ukrainian, it was a refutation of the idea of the Russian world. And then comes Maidan, and the Kyiv Patriarchate directly supported the Euromaidan Revolution. One of the key events that happened in the Euromaidan Revolution is from when the protesters were fleeing the cops that were beating, just whopping them on Maidan Nezholonosti, went up the hill. It's a short walk, but it's a steep walk, to get up to St. Michael's, and they sought sanctuary in St. Michael's. The police tried to get into St. Michael's, but didn't let them. And as the police are trying to break into St. Michael's Cathedral, the priests there sound every bell, an ancient signal that your city is under attack by hostile outside forces. The story goes that this was the first time that it happened in Kyiv since the sack of the city by the Mongols. In this moment of the protesters seeking sanctuary in the church, of the church protecting them, of the police laying siege to the church and not letting them get out, the revolution, for a brief period, was located within St. Michael's. That was one of the key moments of the Euromaidan Revolution. And what I think is the point where it elevated from a street protest against a direct policy of the Yanukovych government and became about the nation. And Filaret played his role in that. he was in charge. So after Maidan, there are now more efforts in place to Ukraine's independence from Russia. And one of them was that the Kyiv Patriarchate and the UAOC once again entered into talks to merging. It had come up a few other times up until that point, but it never got very far. But now that Ukraine was firmly in this nation-building mood, the time was right to finally merge together. And so negotiations began to create a unified Ukrainian church, which eventually happened in 2019. I'll spare the full story of how that happened. It involved a lot of delicate diplomacy guided by then President Poroshenko to mend the hurt feelings that would have existed between the Kyiv Patriarchate and the UAOC. And it was done by bringing in the ecumenical patriarch, the guy in Istanbul. I'm not going to get into that full story because it's a very complicated story, and that's not really the point here. But in the end, what happens is that through this delicate diplomatic process, there is the Orthodox Church of Ukraine that comes out of it. It's a merger of the Kyiv Patriarchate, the UAOC, and a bunch of Moscow Patriarchate priests who defect from the Moscow Patriarchate to join the Ukrainian Church. So then comes the question, who's going to be in charge of it? The obvious answer was Filaret. He was already effectively the head of the Ukrainian Church. He was the head of the largest organization that was merging to become it. He had baggage for the previous, since 1990, had been in fights with a lot of other church hierarchs in Ukraine, to the point where people accepted that he would be the head of the church, but there was always grumbling about one thing he did or another. And so the joint decision by the hierarchs of the new Orthodox Church of Ukraine decided that he would not get the job. This job that he had wanted for so very long. And instead, they elected Epiphanius, the first primate of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, while Filaret was given the title of honorary patriarch. He would not be in charge, but it was recognized how important he was and how respected he was that he was still allowed the title of patriarch. He did not like this arrangement. He wanted to be the guy. And so, very shortly after, he reestablished the Kyiv Patriarchate, this time only a few people following him, mostly located in St. Volodymyr's Cathedral in Kyiv. It didn't really extend much further. There is a bunch of other conflicts based upon what his role was supposed to be, getting into the weeds that really aren't relevant to non-Orthodox, I believe. So I'll just leave it at that. There were a lot of conflicts of what his position would entail. He saw himself as the head of the church when he was not. He wanted to be the head of the church, certainly. He tried to appoint his own bishops, which was outside of his authority, leading to being censured, and a lot of the bad blood came between him and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. But that bad blood did not really override the respect he was due, and it was kind of decided that this guy was already old. He was already, in his 90s. He was not going to be around for so much longer. So whatever conflicts that he would have with the Orthodox Church of Ukraine could largely be sidelined. They did not need to enter a war with the old man. He could preside over St. Volodymyr's, and really most people who go to church in Ukraine would not even notice the difference. I've talked to people who would have their weddings or something in St. Volodymyr's. They did not know that this was technically not a part of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine because there was no real difference. It was just a personal conflict between Filaret and everyone else, which raises the question, what now? Because indeed, the old man did finally die at the age of 97 years old. He lived a full life, and this church that he kind of was having, let's say it, in this church, they was kind of having a dispute over what's going to happen to it now. It existed solely off of his name. After he died, they appointed Patriarch Nicodemus to replace him. I don't know if Nicodemus has the same name to really pull through with having this dissident church underneath him. I suspect that whoever is still left within the Kyiv Patriarchate will re-merge with the Orthodox Church of Ukraine in short order, and whatever schism might have existed there will mend. But yeah, that brings the point together. He was a difficult man. He was a fractious man. He was someone who wanted to be number one and never was allowed to be number one, which obviously created a lot of problems for him. And so on one hand, we can think of him as this, why did he not just go with it? But that is much too dismissive. He was a key figure in Ukrainian independence. He was a key figure in Maidan. He was a key figure in shepherding Ukrainian national identity throughout years where it has been under threat. And for that, he is truly a foundational figure of modern Ukraine. Rest in peace to Patriarch Filaret. The other patriarch that died in March and was buried on the same day was Patriarch Ilia of Georgia. I'm not going to give a full biography of him as I did for Filaret. Filaret was super important here. I had to say about him. But Ilia in his own right was very important to Georgia. He was the head of the Georgian church since 1977. The Georgian church was always independent from Russia, so it did not have that same baggage to it in that particular way, but it was still part of the Soviet Union. And as the head of the Georgian Orthodox Church, like with Filaret, who guided Ukrainian national identity in a certain extent, Ilia did the same thing with Georgian. Georgian Orthodox Church is, more so than even Ukraine, a central part of the Georgian national identity. The Georgians see themselves as being the first country to convert to Christianity, though there's others who claim the same thing. But at least one of the first like 2 or 3, maybe the first, I don't know. And this connection to Orthodoxy, this connection to Byzantinism, was a major part of what it meant to be Georgian through centuries. And he himself, like Filaret, had strong feelings of local cultural loyalty. Though because the Georgian church was never a part of the Russian church never claimed to control Georgia, he saw more comfort in maintaining a diplomatic connection with Russian Orthodoxy. And in fact, with Georgian independence, one weird quirk of that has been that even though Russia has occupied parts of Georgia, parts of Ossetia and Abkhazia, they considered the Ossetian and Abkhazian churches a part of the Georgian Orthodox Church still. It's kind of a weird thing to think about. Russia considered South Ossetia and Abkhazia to be separate from Georgia, but the Russian Orthodox Church considered South Ossetia and Abkhazia part of the Georgian Orthodox Church. Politically, not Georgia. Religiously, Georgia. Some conflict on that. But because of this stance, he became the main diplomatic connection between Russia and Georgia after the 2008 invasion, when Georgia was not cool with Russia, which is better than as it is now, where the Georgia Dream Party is completely subservient to Russia. But at the time, Patriarch Ilia was the only real diplomatic point between the two. And he was widely supported in Georgia and had the confidence of Russia. Everyone kind of supported him. Though as Georgia Dream came into power, he himself became a strong supporter of Georgia Dream, and Georgia Dream relied on the Georgian Orthodox Church to back its social conservative stances. And now that the Georgian Orthodox Church has tied itself so strongly to the pro-Russian government there, people have soured more on the church hierarchy, we can say. So yes, he dies in March, and now there is a bit of a complication regarding his funeral, because the Moscow Patriarch and the Ecumenical Patriarch don't talk to each other anymore. How it works is that if you follow the Ecumenical Patriarch, the Greek, so that's separate from Greek Orthodoxy, don't worry about it, then you can pray in a Russian Orthodox church. But if you're Russian Orthodox, you're not allowed to pray in an Ecumenical Greek Patriarch church, technically. People can do it anyway, but they are in schism. But both of these patriarchs came to the funeral, and if the Ecumenical Patriarch was speaking, the Russians could not be there. And he did speak, and the Russians had to not be there. Now, thankfully for everyone involved, there were multiple events. The ecumenical patriarch did not speak at all of them, so the Russians went to those elements of the funeral as long as the person that they were fighting with was not also there. Messy stuff. Messy stuff of your friend inviting two people to a party who hate each other and everyone having to arrange the party so they're not in the same room together. That's what happened at this funeral. Now, there's not so many questions about where the church will go after his death. There are some competing factions going on. The winner will most likely be Shio Majuri, who is the temporary head of Georgian Orthodoxy until a more formal election can take place. But he is pro-Russian. He supports the pro-Russian government. Most of the other competitors are the same. The Georgian Orthodox Church is likely to not change very much. But this is another figure of the post-Soviet world, a religious head of a church who kind of ushered through the national development of the people that he oversaw, but under very different political circumstances, buried on the same day. So this appears like I'm approaching my desired time limit for this particular episode. As I stated at the start, I have an incredibly long script that I'm just kind of trudging my way forward on. So I'm currently on point 6 out of 13. And that seems to be about half, right? So, okay. I kind of wanted one more, but so be it. But that means that our last topic will also be our second cultural one. And this involves a Russian archaeologist who has been working in Crimea until he was eventually arrested. Alexander Putyagin is a Russian archaeologist who works for the Hermitage Museum and is the head of the Northern Black Sea Classical Archaeology Department. The Hermitage, if you're unfamiliar with Russia, is a massive museum in St. Petersburg that occupies a very iconic spot on the St. Petersburg coastline, and is in fact one of the largest museums in the world, with the largest collection of paintings in the world. And you can understand it as a Russian alternative to the Smithsonian, which also means that it has branches and collections all over the place, not just at its main campus in St. Petersburg. And Putyagin, in his case, was working out of Crimea, with his specialization mostly in the Greek period. Crimea, along with the rest of the southern Ukrainian coast, was, in the classical period, home to a large number of Greek city-states. Some of them were simply colonies of larger city-states, and some of them grew large enough to the point where they were able to be independent on their own terms. See my Ukrainian History 101 episode for more information about that. But it is an extremely archaeologically rich area, especially due to the fact that the Black Sea itself, due to it being a very low oxygen environment, is excellent at preserving any shipwrecks. And if you go to Odessa, I'm not sure if the museum in Odessa is open at the moment that has a extremely well-preserved Greek ship. So if you're a fan of Greek history, the Black Sea coast of Ukraine is an excellent place to go, though at the moment it's a bit tricky, seeing as how many of these sites are either occupied or very close to the front lines. And Putyagin was working in Crimea even before the Russian annexation, particularly at the spot of Myrmikion, near the city of Kerch, and in ancient times was actually known as a major producer of wine. Crimea has a very Mediterranean climate and is a big wine-producing area. When I first got to Ukraine, I was still able to get some Crimean wine that was on the shelves from before it was being occupied. It was pretty good. Unfortunately, that's no longer an option. So he was working at this site before the occupation and continued to work on the site after the occupation. Although the whole time he himself is Russian. Before the occupation, things were going pretty well with Russia, to the point where inviting scientists and archaeologists and experts was not a big deal. He just kept working on the site, only now illegally. And that is what he was accused of by Ukraine, of doing archaeological digs without a permit, by taking artifacts out of Ukraine, smuggling. I'm sure from his perspective, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was working in Russia with Russian permits, but that's not what was actually happening. He was, in fact, doing illegal digs, robbing Ukrainian antiquities, which is actually a pretty big crime in Ukraine. And so Ukraine issues a wanted notice for him for doing illegal archaeology, doing archaeology without a permit, because the only way to get a permit is through the Ukrainian government, which he did not do. That said, even though he is a part of the occupation, he still was broadly accepted in much of Europe, which is much of the level that Russians are still able to do this nonsense, that still have access to European education and high culture and all that, is mind-boggling. How this guy was still able to deliver lectures in Western Europe while working for the Hermitage is disgusting, but that's what he was doing. He was on a lecture circuit. He was primarily in the Netherlands giving talks on Black Sea archaeology and Greek city-states in the area, and on his way back to Russia, he went through Poland. The Poles had that warrant in their hands and arrested him while he was passing through. This happened in December of 2025, last year. Ukraine requests his extradition, which is then approved. Though currently he is going through the appeals process, this could take a little bit longer to completely go through. But it seems like it will happen, and he will be delivered to Ukraine, will be tried, and if found guilty, which he very likely was, because he's not even denying that this is what he did. It was literally his job. It was on his CV. The thing that was on his CV was directly a crime. It's not it's not a very it's not a very shades of gray type issue. He is guilty and could face, I believe, 5 years in prison for this. But he does have a legal defense, and this legal defense is really why I want to talk about this, because it is fascinating. And it comes in two parts, one pretty basic, the other interesting. So the first part of this defense is that he did get permission from the appropriate authorities, in this case, the Russian government. Obviously, that is not something that will fly in Ukrainian court, nor is that will be something that will fly in the Polish courts when it comes to deciding on his extradition. In order for the authorities to be the appropriate ones, Ukraine or Poland would have to recognize Crimea as Russia, and that's not going to happen. So that is a completely absurd defense. The only thing that you could say is that he was under the impression that he got a permit from the appropriate authorities, which could be a mitigating factor, but that is unlikely to be an acceptable defense either, because that would mean that this very high-level academic who travels all around the place was somehow unaware of the illegal nature of the Russian invasion and annexation of Crimea. And that is ridiculous. And while Ukraine is not exactly very strict on this point, when a high-level or famous person especially goes to Crimea, and just goes to Crimea, that means that they are going to Crimea without passing through Ukrainian border control, and therefore it means they're illegally entering Ukrainian territory. From that Russian's perspective, they are not entering a new country, but they are. It doesn't matter what their perspective is. And when that has happened, when it comes to artists, singers, that kind of thing, it has gotten them entry bans from Ukraine as well as legal actions taken against them. It is illegal to go to Crimea without Ukraine's permission, because it is Ukraine, let alone do archaeological digs. But this second point is kind of a contradiction on that first point, because while they cannot necessarily deny that he was doing these illegal digs without making up who has the authority to legalize them, the other half of the accusation against him is that he was removing Ukrainian cultural artifacts from Crimea without permission. So not just digging, but smuggling, essentially. And so their argument for that is that no, he did not remove these artifacts from Crimea. they only went to the East Crimean Historical and Cultural Museum Reserve in Kerch, only a short distance away from the archaeological site and Myrmekian. Though he was not only working at Myrmekian, this is the main thing being argued here is about his digs there. And since these artifacts did not leave Crimea or did not leave Kerch, that means he could not have smuggled them internationally. That there is a difference between if he had taken them to Kerch and if he had taken them to St. Petersburg or Moscow. Now, from the point of view of a court, this is an important distinction. It can be a part of his actual defense. That yes, he may have done these illegal digs, but he did not smuggle them out of the country. Therefore, for him, that could help his case. But in order to make that argument, you kind of have to recognize that Crimea is Ukraine, don't you? Had to recognize that there is a difference between taking something to Kerch, which is in Ukraine, and taking something to St. Petersburg, which is in Russia. That these artifacts did not travel internationally, but only domestically. And that was just extremely amusing to me. Because, yeah, it does help his personal case. He individually has done less of a crime if this is true. And it's not fully true because other sites that he was working on did deliver artifacts into Russia. Just in this case, they had to, in order to defend him, in order to make his own legal case, they kind of recognized that Crimea is Ukraine. And isn't that just wild? And since the Hermitage is a branch of the state, that has to be the Russian state itself making that. Now, I'm not one of these people who thinks that countries can be caught in some kind of linguistic logical puzzle that makes them vanish in a puff of smoke, like there's some kind of like face spirit or something that asks you a riddle in the forest. You can't catch them in a logical trap and take them down debate me bro style. But when it does happen, it at least feels a little nice. And that does line up with other distinctions that Russia has been making, because they do not treat the occupied territories as actually a part of Russia as much as they claim to do. But the other part of this is the issue of archaeology, of course, and the abuse of archaeology that Russia has done, especially in Crimea, because it is such a rich area for archaeology, but also elsewhere. Russia has looted every museum that it has occupied. Kherson was robbed blind, and there is an ongoing effort to rescue Ukrainian archaeological heritage from spots near the front line before the Russians can reach it. A lot of stone babas, they're called, these statues that were made in the Bronze and Iron Ages, and even onward. Everyone loved to make these statues, it seems. In evacuating them from their spots, either just out in the open, there's a lot of these just sitting around, or in museums, and taking them to Kyiv or other sites for safekeeping. This is a part of the war that's happening, is Russia trying to steal archaeological heritage and Ukraine trying to protect it from them. And in Crimea, there has been a lot of archaeological vandalism, essentially, because the Russians, what they are doing historically, archaeologically, is their only interest is to solidify the Russian claim to the area. And this Russian claim that was actually made, in the 1700s when they conquered the territory was based on the Greek connection. The Russians claimed to be the inheritors of Rome, Greek Orthodox culture, the protectors of it, and as the continuation of the Third Rome, anything Greek in the area they considered themselves to be the inheritors of. And so these sites like Myrmekian or others are held up as a part of the continuous inheritance from Greece into Russia. And even the naming of a lot of these places, when the area was conquered initially by Catherine, Odessa, Sevastopol, these places were given Greek names for this very reason. They were not called that beforehand. So this Greek heritage is emphasized, even though Russia, genocided them as well, while other forms of heritage, particularly the Crimean Tatars, are just straight up abused. In the name of doing reconstruction at the Hans Palace in Bakhchisarai, the Russians basically just destroyed the place. They removed a lot of the historical architecture and replaced it with just like bricks of concrete in a lot of places. It's disgusting. So we really have to say that archaeologists like this Alexander Budyagin guy are a part of the Russian imperial project. He's not just an expert operating outside of politics, digging up clay pots or whatever. He's a part of the invasion. He's a part of the war. He knows what he's doing. But then this latest update is that on the backs of this call for extradition, the European Union has added 2 members of Russia's Academy of Sciences and other officials to its latest sanctions package. This sanctions package and the reason for these officials to be added to it relates to their illegal excavations in occupied Crimea. So it's not just Alexander who is facing consequences for this, though the fact that he is the one actually in detention means that he's going to be the one that actually gets punishment, while the others are harder to get a hold of. But being on sanctions lists will at least prevent them from travel. So the director of the Russian Academy of Sciences Institute for the History of Material Science, Andrei Polyakov, is under sanction, particularly at the Chersonosis site, as well as being one of the people responsible for the essential destruction of the Hans Palace in Bakhchisarai. Nikolai Makarov is the director of the Russian Academy of Sciences Institute for Archaeology and the vice president of the Russian Academy of Sciences for, quote, being a central actor in Russia's state-directed archaeological exploitation of the occupied Crimean Peninsula. Therefore, Nikolai Makarov is supporting and implementing actions and policies which undermine or threaten the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence of Ukraine. Budyagin was added to the sanctions list. Mykolai Petrovsky, the director of the State Hermitage Museum, has, quote, publicly endorsed Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and backed legislation enabling the incorporation of cultural items from Ukrainian museums into Russia's State Museum Fund. Under his leadership, the Hermitage has conducted unauthorized archaeological excavations in occupied Crimea, including the destruction of protected Ukrainian heritage sites, thereby serving the Kremlin's goal of legitimizing its territorial claims under the guise of academic work. And Sergei Obryvalin, Deputy Cultural Minister, who oversees key departments within the Cultural Ministry, including the Department of State Protection of Cultural Heritage, Museum Oversight, and the Russian Military Historical Society. These departments are directly involved in the seizure of Ukrainian cultural property and its reclassification as Russian. These quotes come from the Kharkiv Human Rights Protection Group by Helena Hornyash. So credit to Helena for that. Okay, hello again. This is now coming from editing, which took place a few days after recording. Well, you know how I said that this guy would face justice? It turns out that no, he will not. He was actually a part of a prisoner exchange that took place between Poland and Belarus. Now, not all of the details of this prisoner exchange have come out, particularly the identities of the Belarusians who were released from Polish captivity, though they do seem to mostly be spies. But Poland also released this archaeologist. He was released to Belarus and will likely be on his way back to Russia and eventually to Crimea. But one person who Poland got in return was Andrzej Poszkobut, who is an extremely important activist in Belarus. He was one of the leaders of the Polish community there and was in fact the recipient of the Sakharov Prize, the European Union's main prize to honor people who are important in the field of human rights. Moldova and Czechia and Romania were also involved in organizing this swap. Now, am I upset that he will not be facing justice? Yes, I am, but that is how these prisoner exchanges work. My only concern is that a lot of the articles I've read to try and clear up what exactly happened in this swap don't seem to mention Ukraine. This was Ukraine's prisoner. He was in prison for what he did to Ukraine. He wasn't Poland's to give away. Hopefully, further information will come out that Poland did cooperate with Ukraine and Ukraine gave the go-ahead for this. I hope. Ukraine has not yet issued any complaints about this, so I assume it was okay with them, but we're kind of operating in the realm of the lack of information, making the assumption that it went smoothly. So I hope that Ukraine gave this the go-ahead. Otherwise, this was a huge overstep by Poland if not. But I'll definitely be keeping an eye out if that develops in that direction or not. So that is wrapping us up for now. In our next episode, that I'll try to get out as quickly as I can, we'll be talking about Ukrainian diplomacy in the Middle East and Zelensky's newfound friendship with much of the leaders of the Arab world and some of the frictions that Ukraine is currently having with Israel. We'll be talking about some of these developments coming out of Moldova, very optimistic developments coming out of Moldova, some of the challenges that Putin is facing domestically, another anti-Ukraine bill going through Congress, and the Kyiv independence investigation into the Yellow Ribbon movement, which is going to be a very challenging one to talk about. So thank you all very much for listening. If you'd like to support Ukraine Without Hype, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype. You can look at our link tree for resources about Ukraine and causes you may like to donate to, and for more information about Ukraine on the daily news, every news update that comes out of the country, you can go to the main employer of Romeo and I. That is the new voice of Ukraine at english.nv.ua. But for our own patrons here at Ukraine Without Hype, thank you very much to Randy McNerlin. The voices in my head are from Big Pharma, Kyle Smith, Damascus Medusa, Giorgio, David Shepard, Ivana Krakowskaya, Mike, Kevin Albritton, Michael Drucker, PLM, Arminius, T. Bart, Barbara Stetchen, Devi, Anonymous, Michael Wickman, Jenny Louise, Marguerite, Dmitry Litvin, Dennis Napalm, Vivek, James Burke, Allison Chainsaw, Big Meg, Elizabeth Hughes, Nick Niazin, Andy S., John Gates, Sanjay, Grace Krause, Laura De Leon, Had to Laugh, Jacob Poem, Chris Bennington, Levy Grove, James Wise, Alex Groschmal, Ada McDonald, Jerd, Victor Matei, Scott Tokyuk, Etienne Soleil, Anastasia, Captain Technical, Evelyn, Veronica Aim, Julia Lindsay, Emily Bavona, Scott Burry, Anonymous, Subtle Knife, Marianne, RDK, Laurie Halila, Christopher Yee, Lemonenkin, Demetrio, Ursula Zolenkoff, Noah Brown, Glowing Wind, Can Dystopian Fiction Please Remain Fiction, Marcus Naskus, Andrew Glenn, Zay Perry, William Brown, Abel Lenz, Denna Jones, Joseph Verlone, Yellow Duck, Anonymous, Bucktron 2021, Florian Kunkel, Matthew Rowe, and Bill. Thank you all very much for your support. You're what make this all possible. And until next time, when I summit the mountain of this script, Slava Ukraini!